Okay, so what we're going to talk about initially is a group work tool that Pierre was involved very heavily in developing. But to frame the whole session is about supporting innovation. How do we support particularly bottom-up innovation at Exeter in relation to teaching and the tools that we need? And of course, there is some support already for bottom-up innovation. We've got the Education Incubator, and we'll invite Kerry a little later to say a little bit more about that and how the Education Incubator supports this sort of stuff. There are also various pots of funding. The Alumni Annual Fund can allow people to bid for innovative projects to support the student experience. There are discretionary funds from heads of department, from directors of education and student experience, from APVCs for education, etc. But it's still very challenging, even with support for some of these pilot initiatives, to go from idea to piloting that idea to getting wider scale support for a solution at institutional level, particularly if you want to move it into business as usual. Thanks, Pierre. So as I said a moment ago, what we're going to do is present a bit of a success story where a small scale solution has led to work at institutional level to roll out this wider solution. But we also want, as part of this session, to host a discussion about how Exeter can better support these processes. And specifically, what the tool that we've been working on is to do with group work and peer ratings. So, as I'm sure people in the call know, one of the challenges of group work is ensuring that the final individual mark reflects the contribution of the individuals involved. So in a group, you can have people who do lots of work, people who don't do very much work at all, and typically they'll get the same mark. And there are various ways of dealing with that situation. You can, of course, just ignore it and say it's group work and everyone should get the same mark. But there are ways of weighting the marks to get individualized marks from a group mark. One of the ways that is used at the university in physics is a method called Sharpe's method that tests for statistical significance in the ratings that peers give each other in the group to indicate their relative contributions. And it allows for various things such as capping how far the individual mark can deviate from the group mark. And Charles Williams has automated some of this, some of the calculations in essentially a series of spreadsheets that take groups of different sizes and check for statistical significance of the peer ratings and then recalculates the individual mark based on the group mark and the ratings themselves. So if we move on to the next page, there's still a lot of manual process involved in that because it's still a spreadsheet. You have to copy paste all the marks in and everything else. So Justin Hinshelwood in Renewable Energy wanted to see if we could automate this process of collecting the marks, of getting them calculated into the spreadsheets or however we wanted to do it, getting the lecturer to be able to review the marks, review the peer feedback as well, and return these to the students. And initially, Justin applied for some funding from APVC Education, Nikki King, and got a little bit of money to employ Pierre as a student campus partner over a summer. And then Pierre got a job as a DLD, and he continued to work on that alongside all the other things that he did as a DLD. And we worked towards a pilot solution. And that's where I'm going to hand over to Pierre to talk to us through going from that idea through to the pilot solution through to what's now happening.
Thank you very much. So for a little bit of context, the method on which the spreadsheet that Barrie mentioned came out, I think, in 2002. And in the conclusion bits, it says that that method should be automated. And it talks of these newfangled sparkling things called spreadsheets, and that one might be able to do that in this. And this is how old the method that we're using is. The spreadsheet automated the calculations for a single group, but in a large cohort with multiple questions, with a lot of group members, the complexity is basically the number of groups multiplied by the number of people in a group multiplied by the number of questions you're asking. And so in a reasonable module, you get to about 4,000 data points that you have to manually copy and paste from 40 different spreadsheets, which is quite unwieldy. So the idea was to try and take that thing of, right, let's not ask each group or each person to fill in their own spreadsheet or form, but rather let's build a tool that will allow you to put in the name of the students once, put them in their groups, set the questions for the whole assessment, and then the tool would set up everything, and you would only need to review the comments and the marks, but all of that collection process and that manual churning, that would be error prone. And one of the academics that ran that told me it took them 2 days to run the calculations for a single assessment point, which obviously isn't scalable. And even though peer review has got a lot of value, it's not something that you'd want to run if that took you that amount of time at the busy exam period. So this is where we started. So my dissertation wasn't going impressively well, but then my dissertation leader brought me up with Barrie and Justin and said, oh, they're wanting to do something similar. Do you want to work with them? And that turned into my dissertation. So we made, in what is it, 2 months, a month and a half, a proof of concept that we could then, we could set up to go, oh, okay, this is a viable option to test out the waters. We then took that proof of concept, and as Barrie said, I got employed as a DLD. So as part of my role, I started working on this as a side piece, so taking that proof of concept and actually turning into a product that we could make, that we could put in front of students, in front of academics, and see how that worked. That worked reasonably well. And after a bunch of testing with Justin, we felt confident that we could try that out at a larger scale, because we developed the pilot to be able to work at that larger scale with the back end of things. And we ran that with 7 modules in term 2 last year. And that worked quite well, except we really hit on the limitations of the technology stack that we were using, that we had to do because it was the only way to authenticate users with what was available to us in terms of technology stacks at the university. We had no way of getting something that was more powerful or more streamlined. So sometimes the system would break down, and it was through no fault of anything we'd made. Well, it kind of, but also the technology stack wasn't helping. So in the term 1 that followed, I supported 4 modules to run their peer assessment. Not any new modules, they were previous modules that I'd helped before, and so didn't want to leave out cold, but also didn't want to extend it because there was difficulty in getting supports for this and getting time, because it wasn't in a state, and I don't think I could have gotten it in a state where it could be a self-service tool that we could give academics and let them deal with it. Following that, we managed to get funding to test out an external tool that had been talked about before in the university. And this is what we're currently testing. We're currently in the evaluation stage of that tool. It's worked quite well, but it's also got a few issues here and there that we're trying to work out whether we can recommend that one to be funded for the future, or whether we need to get another pilot to keep going. So the future is currently unclear. There is positive hope, but also no assurances of where we're going with it. Now, the interesting thing with that timeline is those key points here. And these are points where people have gone to me, or I've met with people and gone, so you have also built at the university on your own a tool to automate peer review. Now, the first one was quite funny to me because it was also with the same technology stack. It was a different approach to it. So it was a single module approach, whereas I built it to be able to take as many modules and assessments as we wanted. but it was so striking to me that the core technology enhanced learning team, as it was called back then, one person in there had built a tool that did exactly what we wanted, or kind of, and we didn't know about it. So we built another one. And then each of these grand points was somebody else telling me about their own approach that also either didn't scale well, or didn't have that many features, or was kind of labor intensive. It's like everybody, they crop up like little flowers in the desert on a day of rain, but they never go anywhere because there isn't support to get there. So I'm going to walk through the different stages of what we did and how we went about it. Yeah, so the first bit was that proof of concept. And so we're working directly with Justin and Barrie with constant feedback to try and establish what the needs of not only the tool itself, but the pilot within the given amount of time we had was. And that kind of set the stage for the whole 2 years that were coming up. There was no time to build a fully functional system. But the core functionality that we built demonstrated that it would be possible to do this in a way that would automate the collection of the peer review data, that would allow a user interface that was easy. We made revisions so that instead of being like the form that we had before, where it was a mark out of 100 for different questions, it was fast because we had technology. We could make it a lot more user-friendly to work with. And so we built that skeleton, but we built that skeleton early in that proof of concept, and then had to use that skeleton all the way through. Now, the problem is we had to go with Power Automate, and Power Automate, Power Apps, and the SharePoint all suite is the only thing that allowed us to get single sign-on for users. And that was a core thing where, for GDPR and user friendliness reasons, we needed to have a platform that we could have tap into the single sign-on. You couldn't have it so that students would need to submit formative assessment to an external tool by creating a site. That would just not be okay. The problem is Power Automate is not designed for any of this, not for anything that big. So the data structures were very complicated to deal with. The code is an unbelievable spaghetti mess. And it's not just because of my experience at the time, it's also because the way that it's thought is for small things, and that's the only thing we had available to us. So that was funded by APVC funding, like Barrie mentioned. And then we moved on to the next stage of the pilot, which was taking that skeleton and actually making sure that the core functionality, marking, exporting, we had a tool that automated all of the computation and concatenated all of the comments, and then took the group feedback and the group mark and created a feedback sheet that you could upload straight into BART. It would do that for all of the people in the assessments once the things were reviewed, and you could upload the spreadsheet to LA and it would work. It's still on Power Automate because we didn't have a choice, and it was not very stable for academics at all. Everything kind of broke down, but students it had a positive impact on students. So we kept going, and it's still Power Automate. It's still live users with actual summative assessment, and still a bit of struggle for academics, still issues here and there. I was still coding features as we noticed that we were running into edge cases with larger modules or with smaller modules. And what we found is that it was very time consuming for me, but for academics, it was still a lot better than the manual approach. And for students, it was a lot better because they would get feedback a lot faster. They would get richer feedback. They would get less errors in their feedback because they wouldn't copy and paste the wrong numbers for the wrong person. And also, the key thing is automating all of that and using that technology allowed for running peer review formatively. And that was like the key thing that I thought we brought to this experience, is because we reduced that timescale from 2 days to about an hour, it was a lot more possible for somebody to run snapshots of feedback at different stages of a big group project, and then all building to one large summative assessment. But the students would be re-engaged every time you had that check-in, and tutors for groups would also be able to come into those groups and check how that worked. And that was really, really supportive. So that's still, that went really well. And then, as I explained earlier, I supported the same, a few modules. I didn't do outreach because scalability of the tool just wasn't there, and we couldn't get any further. It was really difficult to try and get funding. It was at a time of team changes and reorganizations and people moving in and out. And we managed to get funding almost miraculously for a pilot tool that was developed by UCL over 10-ish years. And we ran that with a lot of the modules from last year, a few more, a few less. And that was very, very successful. Now, that tool is built by UCL for UCL, and they're trying to roll it out, but they've also got their own specific needs. And then we've got Ellie, which, although we've transitioned to Ellie 2 for intercompatibility reasons, so we could tap into the wider ed technology market, we've still got hyper customizations here and there, which means that because of our non-standard approach, we would need customizations from their software to be able to do the things that we need them to. So there's discussions with them, there's questions of whether we would fund the changes, whether we couldn't fund the changes and then need a different approach. So we also don't know who would fund the tool long term, because it's a commercial enterprise for UCL, and we don't know, where that would go. And that was funded by the Student Experience Partnership Board, which was very generous. The problem is getting feedback from students to feedback to the SCBP is very difficult because students don't answer surveys. So it's also hard to show them how valuable that feedback has been with actual student feedback. Now, where we are and what we've learned is scaling up is quite difficult. And it's not only a question of scaling up technology and so on, but the red tape and the support and the communication around the university and the lack of centralization of efforts means that going from, oh, I want to do this thing, which a lot of people have had across the university. I've had 4 people that I know develop an in-house tool at Exeter for this exact purpose, to that we're using external tools that are now defunct. So there is demand for it that crops from different places, but there is no unified approach to, right, let's actually tackle this thing and do it properly, because it's all from the ground up and there isn't support from up there to take it and go forwards. And yeah, there's we're not sure who would fund the next the rollout of such tool, or where the pilot, if we need to run a separate pilot, SCPB might not fund that one. Where would we get that funding? And the other thing is, we had a lot of stars align for that pilot. Barrie and Justin finding me while I was doing my dissertation on something similar, and then me being able to get the DLD role, and me talking to the right people at the right time, or Barrie doing the same, or meeting. So it was really, we're quite lucky to be here. There's a lot of hard work, so we kind of made our own luck as well. But yeah, it's been a struggle to get here, and yeah, I think especially towards the start, so for the first year and a half, I heard from a lot of teams across the university when I was asking for support, no. And that was the main answer I got. It took me 7 months to get a development environment from IT for Power Automate. So before that, I had everything in my production environment. So when I was coding things up and there would be a change that needed to happen, I would be doing it live while students were on the same environment. So it took me 7 months to get a development environment where I could make my changes and then validate them, test them, make sure they're stable, and then push them out to production. It took me a long time to be allowed to do a lot of things, and people kept telling me no. And now things are changing. It might be because, you know, I've been here longer, or because the people are changing, or because the philosophy is evolving. But I'm hearing a lot more yes, but, and that's always a lot more encouraging, because if somebody tells you yes, but you can work with that, you can, you know, frame your work in a certain amount of respect. But yeah, that's me done rambling. And I think I can stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks very much, Pierre. It's obviously a labour of love that's gone into that. And so before we get on to a discussion about some of the issues you've raised there, we did invite Kerry Deacon from the incubator to come along and say a few words about the services that she and her team can offer in this kind of area in terms of encouraging innovation and building up new projects. So Kerry, did you want to come in and say a few things?
I can, and I note that Toby's here with me too. So Toby, if you want to come in as well. I can talk from an incubator perspective, Toby, from the get-go, and then maybe hand over to you about the role. Because there's a few, well, everyone knows about the incubator on this call. Philippe, I don't know if you do, so I'm just going to share a little bit about the incubator, which is a University of Exeter initiative set up in 2017 to support pedagogical innovations and enable our educators, academic professional services staff to test ideas that they would like to bring into their learning and teaching practice, and to support that student engagement approach across the university. Originally, they were quite large-scale projects. Barrie and Lael and Lisa, you might remember back then about how quite large those pots of funds were originally. And over the years, we've reduced that down to small-scale seed funding to support our educators to test, fail, make connections. As you say, Pierre, you know, you had a serendipitous moment of like Barrie talking to different people while you were talking to different people, you're doing this. And I feel that happens quite a lot in that innovation space, and that kind of collaborative co-creation space too, when we're putting ideas out there in the world and we want to try and test them in a kind of practical way. And so the incubator is a space to explore that, and you are supported in that. You're supported in that with a network mentor. Lisa and Barrie have been network mentors in the past. Lael, I can't remember if you have been or not. I'm not quite sure. But they're a space to try and meet people and develop an ecosystem around innovation, which is something I'm picking up on, Pierre, and you talking about your experience around this too. It's like somebody else is doing this over here. Somebody else is doing this over here, and like, oh, how can we grow from each other, exchange ideas, and augment that tech space as well, which I think is a space for the incubator to hold that, as well as other spaces across the university do that too. You know, in the Exeter Innovation Team, they hold space for academics to develop any of their work into kind of a more commercial space. And the other thing I want to pick up on is around all these different pots of funding. There are so many different pots of funding, and I'm aware that our team growing is trying to pull together and navigate where internally all these different places sit, all these different funds sit, and what's agreeable to one faculty to fund or one department to fund, and what is different to another, and how we can be a little bit more aligned and understand who's funding what across those spaces. And I think the other thing to say is that the incubator is moving into a space of acceleration. So we're trying to bring in a new grant that will be opening up in September, which is to support support projects that are at a place of like, well, where do we've got something. I note that you've got four internal stakeholders, 2 external stakeholders. And that actually probably happens for quite a lot of our projects that come through the incubator. But then where do they go once they've done a cycle of incubation funding? And I know that, and I'm going to bring Toby in on this now, because this is what we are trying to move forward with in being part of a larger team within Exeter at the moment, in terms of like, how can we support those who have tested something, it works, there is an idea to kind of develop it, and there is kind of support to potentially develop it. Again, it's that serendipitous moment of like, oh, we're doing this over here. How can we work together, and how can we work that forward, which has not ever happened in the incubator before, and probably hasn't really been supported, well, in my knowledge, it kind of last 2.5 years, except for me going, can you go and have a conversation with so-and-so and see how we can support you from a more connecting space. But from September, we are starting acceleration grants. And so that is for all incubator fellows in the past few years who developed something, still is sitting with something, still needs development from something, because these take time, innovation takes time, and how we can potentially match fund any other funds that you've got internally or externally to develop that project further. I'm going to segue into you, Toby, and maybe you want to kind of explore that a little bit more, and also about technology as well, and how we're moving forward in that space.
Yeah, Carrie, you honestly did a really good job of summarizing everything. So I'm hoping I can add something of meaning to this through some of my comments. But in addition to the things Carrie was talking about, part of the experimentation and innovation team will be looking at emerging tech and how it can be used for teaching and learning, and contribute to the experience that students and instructors are having as they engage within the university. So in that space, I don't know how terribly relevant it is here, but just for context, looking at things like AR, VR, XR, and spatial computing. Also looking at things like generative AI, obviously a huge topic in the recent 1.5 years. And also being ready for whatever comes next. It won't stop. There won't ever be done changing and innovating on things. In fact, I think it was just 2 days ago, Apple gave a new update about the release dates for their Apple Vision Pro 2 and a cheaper model that'll be more consumer friendly. So these things are happening in this sphere all the time. And so positioning our team in a way that we can pick up the things that there isn't a home for yet, and we want to see where it goes and where there might be a home for it, I think is really kind of the focus of where I see us moving forward. As Carrie was talking about, a lot of those connections, it's about creating those communities of practice and a community of innovation, and where you can draw on connections for folks doing other kinds of work. The hope is that our team would really function in that way, to say, hey, we know of this other thing. And it's not that obviously we won't be doing all of that work, that'd be ridiculous. Instead, it would be, hey, we know of this happening over here with Barrie Cooper. Have you talked to him? This might be a really awesome opportunity for this grant that we're aware of, that's through an external organization. And there's £5,000 that you can apply for internally as well to go along with that. So creating those connections is really awesome. I do want to say something that Pierre, you touched on this, and I think it's really interesting, and you'll see this in anything. Your experiences, while it's great that you're doing it, it's not a unique experience to see how you can struggle to get this idea out and operational and scaling it up. And I always see that as really kind of a two-pronged challenge. And one is convincing your leadership, because leadership oftentimes unlocks the release of your time to focus on those types of things, even if there is no funding attached to it. And usually that helps the argument, I suppose, but convincing your leadership, but then also convincing the grassroots people who's on the ground, who would be using the tool. And that two-pronged approach hits from both angles, and you tend to meet somewhere in the middle, where you have people at the top talking about it and you have people at the bottom talking about it, even without institutional prioritization. That said, one of the things that is the most beneficial is where you can find an alignment with existing strategic priorities. You know, I don't think it would be a stretch to say that there's probably some alignment with Strategy 2030 if you're leaning into the student experience and efficiencies in teaching and learning, and it's especially like peer learning. There are ways that those arguments can be made to help show the alignments, and it makes it so much easier to unlock those conversations, because your peers that are, you know, faculty that are wanting to use the tool will find it much easier to justify doing it, and the administration that's supporting you will also have an easier time accepting things. So just a couple just thoughts I had from hearing about it, but also happy to answer any questions about our team.